So welcome to this evening's People, Place and Community seminar. This evening, Jack Latimer and Justin Colson are going to be in conversation about digital community archiving. Jack Latimer is a founder committee member of the Community Archive and Heritage Group and set up the Community Archives website. He led the team which developed the National Community Archiving Cataloguing Guidelines. He's also the creative director of Community Sites, a company which specialises in websites and cataloguing software for community archives and heritage projects. Community Sites has set up nearly 200 community heritage websites in the UK and Ireland since it was established in 2006. And Jack became involved with Community Archives when he founded My Brighton and Hove community heritage website in 2000. He led the project as a volunteer for its first 6 years. And over 20 years later, the website has grown to over 11,000 pages of community-generated content and has won numerous awards. So it's really fantastic to have you here with us this evening, Jack, with all of that experience. Justin Colson is Senior Lecturer in Urban and Digital History at the Institute of Historical Research and Deputy Director of the IHR Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. Justin is a historian of towns and cities, specialising in London during the late medieval and early modern period, and uses digital and spatial techniques to study societies and cultures more broadly across time and place. Justin is currently responsible for the IHR's Layers of London Digital Humanities project, which if you have not come across, I would highly recommend seeking out. And I'm sure that Adam is currently putting a link in the chat because that's exactly the sort of thing that Adam is fantastic at doing. Okay, over to you, Jack. Please do get started.
Good day. Hello to you all. So I'm going to share my screen. 1 second. I'll go into presentation. And with a bit of luck, you can see a big screen. Is that correct? Lovely. Very good. All right. Well, hello to you all. And I'm going to talk to you briefly with a kind of introduction to digital community archiving. And the perspective I give, I guess, is that of a practitioner, because I've been involved with this for about 25 years, and with 3 sort of different kind of hats on, I guess. One is as a volunteer. If you kind of look at the logos down the bottom of this screen, I set out kind of, running a project as a volunteer about my hometown as it was then of Brighton and Hove, which I'll talk to you a bit about. One is as a kind of my job, because I've rather fallen into, in the way these kind of hobbies take over your life, I fell into kind of running a small business that sets up websites and cataloguing software for groups around the UK and Ireland. So we've been doing that for the last 20 years. And then also I'm involved in the Community Archives and Heritage Group, which is the national body that has evolved now to be the kind of main kind of organisation that supports and promotes community archives around the UK. So that's me. I'm going to just begin. It's a kind of old chestnut that people debate this for hours. What is a community archive? This is what I mean by it. By and large, archives that are about a local community. So the subject matter tends to be the local community. That community could be a place. It could be a performance venue. It could be a workplace. They often kind of focus on the living history, more recent history. Archives that are created by the local community. So normally we're talking about kind of projects that are basically run by volunteers. You might get a few paid staff in, but most of the time it's volunteers. Archives that are shared with the local community. So quite often what you're doing is just you're sharing what you find quite locally through websites, books, calendars, talks, walks, exhibitions, and archives that are owned by the local community. Now, a lot of the groups that I work with are not even legally constituted in a way that would permit them to own copyright, but also nowadays, I think even the kind of record offices who used to insist on getting copyright rather slightly kind of frown on that. So you try and get the license so you can preserve and share it, but not necessarily acquire the copyright. We don't know how many community archive groups there are around the country. Back in when we first set up the Community Archives and Heritage Group, we commissioned a consultant to find out. They didn't know either. They guessed. at 3,000. I think there are far more than that. We've actually been creating a directory of community archives on our website, and we've got up to 1,000. But again, it just kind of scrapes the surface of how many there are. And historically, the reason they began in the UK, I think, is three things that came together in the kind of towards the end of the last century. One was the advent of the cheap flatbed scanner. So suddenly there was a way of creating digital copies of things. The second was the World Wide Web. So suddenly there was a way of sharing those cheap digital scans. And the third was the Heritage Lottery Fund, which came along in 1994. And there was a great surge of kind of activity in terms of oral history projects and community heritage projects that sprang up like mushrooms around the country, funded by the lottery. One of the first organisations that provided software for these groups who were doing digital things was called Commonet. And that was around from the years 2000 and 2010. It kind of developed out of a project in Yorkshire. They developed their own cataloguing software, hooked it up into a scanner. So it's terribly easy to use. They just kind of sent you a kind of floppy disk, as was then, through the post. They had a kind of application form on their website for the heritage funding. So you could just fill that in, fill in your details, and off it went. And their killer feature was these hotspots, these kind of yellow marks on the photos, which meant that you could identify who people were in photos. Everybody loved that. The difficulty was, and this is a kind of a theme in community archiving and a threat, Commonet kind of overreached themselves slightly when the internet came along and they tried to adapt their technology. They went insolvent in 2010. Their software didn't have an export facility. So there were suddenly about hundreds of groups that had a CD that they couldn't access and an access database that was locked without the password. And that sort of remains the case. You know, we've managed to dig a few of them, but a lot of them are still in that predicament today. So that's one theme. Always have an export feature. That's a typical community archive. They happen to be in a railway station, disused railway station, obviously, in somewhere in the Yorkshire Dales. Universally, these groups seem to be run by about 4 to 8 people, wider pool of contributors, but somehow you need a small enough group to be coherent like that. The cheerfulness, I think, is also fairly typical by and large. And what the process that they're going through is they're collecting material, digitizing it, cataloging it according to one sort of standard or another. And the reason we developed the cataloging standards for community archives is all the museums up and down the country follow one set of cataloging standards, or the record offices, slightly unhealthy, follow another one. They're both too complicated for community groups, so we devised something in the middle. They display their collections and they have the challenge of preserving them in the long term. And a lot of what is said about community archiving is that the process is as important as the product. You know, there's actually a process whereby people learn things, they get together. It's kind of self-validating. Their experiences are validated, their memories are validated. And so, here's a process that the Dales Community Archive group followed. They would first get together, at the top picture there, without any technology, because some people didn't want to, they just wanted to kind of have coffee and look at old documents and be helpful, but not press any buttons. So they would do handwritten lists, indeed, even though they had computers to hand, describing things. Then they would scan things. The big challenge with community archiving is time. So it makes a big difference if you have an overhead photographic scanner as opposed to a flatbed scanner, just because the difference between 7 seconds per scan and 1 second is huge. And then they had a smaller team of people who were kind of feeding the data into a website. So generally speaking, that's the process of community archiving, which is kind of taking place, as I say, up and down the country. I'm going to take you back to an example of a project which I ran as a volunteer, mainly because it kind of shows one very interesting and important theme, I think, in the developments of community archives or community heritage, digital heritage projects over the last 25 years. This is my Brighton and Hove. So I used to live in Brighton, I happened to be in a position where I could get involved in making museum exhibits, touchscreen and museum exhibits in the very early days of that. And I was lucky enough to be part of a group that were asked to kind of create a exhibit about the history of the town for Brighton Museum. And the approach that we proposed to them was that we would get a selection of different perspectives, different people from around the town who would give them a camera each and ask them to do their own little tours of the town, take 8 photos of each place. And then the volunteers would research the history of whatever places they chose. So the most popular perspective that people wanted to hear from was that of a homeless person, out of interest. The least popular, and I'm sorry for those of you who have this profession, was a school teacher. Nobody wanted to hear what they had to say. And the cameras were given out and off they went. That's a school child's tour. She took those 8 photos around the town and was very pleased to be asked. She said, it's about time somebody asked my opinion. And then, oh, that was Jessica. We won't listen to her. I'm sorry, Jessica. We don't value your opinion that much. And then the volunteers, she took a photograph of a pet cemetery, went off and researched everything to do with pets and cemeteries and the location, which was Preston Manor. The key thing, though, was that was a museum exhibit. That was a touchscreen. That was fine. Prince Charles went and looked at it politely, in 1995, and smiled and nodded. But when the millennium came along, and that was the early days of the internet, I was kind of running kind of courses teaching people how to make websites in the early days about kind of local and family history. And I was asked to run a project kind of something, or they wanted me to run courses, but I said, well, let's take that original bank of material and see if we can upload that to the internet. So I expected to run it for 6 months and kind of get 6 volunteers, and 40 volunteers turned up to the first meeting. And so there we were, stuck with it. A great hash we made of it as well back in 2001. Though, in fairness, a lot of websites looked a bit like that then. But it kept on running, and it kept on evolving, and it went through the years. So that's what it looked like in 2011. Then we get on to kind of 2023. It's still running 25 years later. And one of the points about that, I think, the longevity of it, requires me to just get out of this presentation and just take you to the internet. So I'm going to do that. I just stop sharing for a moment. I'm going to try sharing that. So hopefully you can now see a screen. Good, nice, helpful nod. This is from the My Brighton and Hove website. So there's a home page. There's a section of the site which is areas, which is various neighbourhoods where it's all broken down. And then there's an area called Mile Oak, which is one particular neighbourhood within Brighton and Hove. And within that, very early on, some content was seeded. Let's have a little look if I can see if I can find it. Oh, I hope that's it. Yeah, it must be here. There we go. Just a little kind of paragraph of text from somebody who'd written an encyclopedia about Brighton and Hove and let us use it. The point about this, though, is there's a little bit of content there. There's one photo. And then look at the comments. There are 359 of those comments. And there are, an equivalent number of many of those pages. And over the 25 years, a vast amount of kind of perspectives and social history and historical information has flooded in through those contributions. And if I just switch back to the presentation. Hopefully that's it. The result of having all those that content there, more than the technology, was that the website then kind of won various awards because people kind of looked and said, my goodness, the content is rich and it's personal and it's emotional. And it had been run by volunteers, and it was, for a total sum of £2,000. But while we're very proud of that, I think the interesting point is that recent years, Brighton Past Facebook group has set up. Very swiftly, that attracted 37,000 members. That was back in 2011. It's up to 67,000 members now. They have obviously exchanged vast numbers, immeasurable quantities of information and photos of the kind that used to go into My Brighton and Hove. They once kind of actually pulled together some of their photos and created a little kind of, a website, photo albums, but that only contains a few hundred photos, when I last looked. And the value of Brighton Past is fantastic. It's a kind of wonderful resource, but it is fundamentally a conversation. And so one of the changes, because it's not archivable, everything was uploaded under people's individual IDs, and it's not really searchable. So whereas My Brighton and Hove over 25 years, by the same process of people wanting to be helpful, wanting to share, wanting to kind of express their nostalgia, has developed into what I think is a significant historical resource in its own right, really. It's much harder to do that sort of thing nowadays. That moment has passed. So that's one kind of theme to perhaps return to. Looking at some other themes, a quick look across the kind of national picture. After My Brighton and Hove, we developed some software which allowed people to upload material to it without to make it easier for non-technical volunteers to run the site. That became successful, so we had lots of other groups asking us to do similar things, so we set up a small company. So after My Brighton Hove, set up community sites, which provides these websites and software for groups around the country. And I also then started taking an interest in the national picture. I think one of the things about most community archives is they have a very local focus. I was unaware and uninterested in what was happening nationally when I was running My Brighton and Hove. But when I, looked above the parapet, there was sort of the National Archives at that stage just beginning to take an interest. They'd commissioned a report into community archives. They'd got Commonet involved, and this kind of little committee was being formed to see if a body could be set up to support community archives. So I joined that, and that's been running since 2007. It has an annual awards scheme. It has an annual conference. It's now affiliated to the Archives and Records Association. We've got a large mailing list. We have about 1,000 archives listed in the directory, and we try and kind of develop the resources section of the site to provide guidance for community archives. So we were kind of ahead of the game. I mean, I think, internationally, now I think there's actually a funded Centre for Community Archives in Poland, but by and large, people do quite often look at what's happened in the UK and the Community Archive website and say, goodness me, I wish we had something like that where we are. Over those years where I've been sort of kind of, monitoring the community archives scene and occasionally making presentations at community archives conferences, various things have changed. One is just the attitude, the relationship between record offices and community archives. I mean, there used to be a certain amount of suspicion. The community archives themselves didn't like the idea that the record offices wanted to take away all the material and basically hide it in their vaults. And the record offices, I think, perhaps this is kind of overstating it, but they were kind of wary of the groups looking after material that might be historically significant. But that changed. Plus, I think the financial crisis perhaps helped change that. Suddenly there was austerity, and the record offices didn't have the money. And B, do you remember that kind of whole thing about the big society and David Cameron? That went well. So attitudes changed and volunteer activity became very important. So these archivists were saying, we show we are helping give local communities a voice, which helped their own funding. We've moved away from a suspicion of community groups. We had more confidence in them because they could see. Also digital technology was leveling the playing field. Sometimes the groups were kind of moving a bit faster than the record offices in adopting digital technology. That was one change. There's been a long-standing issue with digital preservation because of changing kit. I don't know how many of you probably know the BBC Doomsday Project. That was in 1996. It was done, wasn't it? Because it was the 900th anniversary of the original Doomsday book. So the BBC kind of did a vast project to kind of kickstart the multimedia business as it was, which at that stage depended on those kind of silver platter disc the size of an LP. That was what used to be called a video disc, a technology which rapidly became obsolete. And so it was then, the kind of problem was that 15 years after the second Doomsday project was created, it was inoperable. I think they have now managed to restore it in various museums, but it was it's been a story in digital archiving. Groups have exactly the same problems. Possibly cloud storage is helping because most of the errors that actually come about are to do with human error. Somebody kind of overwriting the backup by mistake, forgetting to log in. That's very common. So anything that kind of helps with kind of the automation of the preservation is helpful. So that's one theme. Of course, you've had the constant change of technologies. My Brighton and Hove, we had to completely put it into. It had 4 completely different sorts of software. It moved from, I think it was originally coded in HTML, and then there was something called Dreamweaver, which you did kind of manually, but it helped you. Then we had to get it into its first database, which we had to build ourselves because that was the days before kind of open source technology came along. And then we had the open source technology. And open source technology has kind of helped a lot. Things like WordPress and Joomla. WordPress has kind of come to the fore, I think. And again, that feels like a more robust future, but the technology keeps changing. You look back at my Brighton Hove, it used to have a kind of flash slideshow across the top of it. And you look at the Wayback Machine, and of course, it doesn't show anymore. There's also the changing legal framework. A lot of community archives were kind of very alarmed by GDPR when that came along, and they were thinking, do we need to kind of get permissions again from all the people we deal with using their personal contact details? Creative Commons licenses came along, which kind of help people share things on the internet. That's been a great boon. And nowadays, the Heritage Fund, one of its conditions of its funding is that you share what you put out with its help, under a Creative Commons license. New ways of exploring collections have come along, and that's one that Layers of London you'll talk about there. So mapping was huge. I remember making a presentation about that, where suddenly you could kind of geolocate your photo collection on a map and overlay it with old maps, etc., etc., etc. And we've had social demographic changes. I mean, I've been kind of training community archivists for the last 25 years, and it's noticeable how the digital natives are growing up, and also I guess the peak age for community archivists is in their kind of the 60s, really. That's kind of newly retired, but still wanting to kind of do things, and that lump of people is kind of moving up. So we're perhaps in the kind of golden period now. But certainly digital skills are growing. And, to be honest, the pandemic helped a bit because everyone learned to use Zoom. And that hugely helped in terms of kind of community archives, doing training courses, communicating with each other, etc., etc. What they struggle with, that's a survey that we did quite a few years ago, but I don't think the situation has changed too much. The biggest problem is about halfway down there, the recruitment of new volunteers. So it's always a challenge of how you're going to pass the baton onto the next generation. And then, other things is clear they look for guidance. How do we preserve physical? How do we look after physically? If we do have a set of physical authorities, how do we look after those? Help us. We're not sure about how to catalogue things, how to do copyright, and yet there's also the kind of the energy that comes from finding your own way and running your own show and it being your own baby, and that's the kind of the fuel which anyone kind of working with community archives doesn't want to kind of drain away and replace with their own ideas, I think. Finally, current issues. I just thought I'd pick out two that I think are in the air. One is, this is an interesting one, copyright. The copyright of images. Now, I mean, a few years back, somebody from the National Archive gave a talk. He was the expert on copyright, about copyright at the Community Archives Conference, and everybody went white because everybody realized they were all kind of possibly breaching copyright. And he said, essentially, it's about management of risk. How likely is it that you're using an image to which somebody else has permission, and that, if you're a community archive group, you're going to be pursued. It is now a lot more likely, I think, potentially, because it is possible to do what's called a reverse image search. So if you're a photographer and you took an image, even 15 years ago, and even if you uploaded it under a Creative Commons license to Wikimedia or something like that, you can go to Pixie, you could upload your image, you could do a reverse image search to find out where else it exists on the internet. And if anyone has left off the appropriate credit to you, as which a Creative Commons license requires, the lawyers will then send them a bill for £900, or basically the license is then void, and they pluck a figure out of the air, and their business is to get money out of these groups. I don't know. I mean, it's a new issue. It's I've come across this far more. It's not a lot, but more significantly more times in the last year than before. And I wonder whether that will have a chilling effect. I mean, it's quite right that copyright should be protected, and yet it changes the management of risk kind of thinking. And the second thing that's happening is the Heritage Lottery Fund, which got everything going, have changed their funding criteria. All the groups I used to work with virtually, there's 200 clients of community sites, used to apply for a tranche of funding between 3,000 and 10,000, and that tranche of funding no longer exists. The minimum is now 10,000. And I think the Heritage Fund says, well, that's partly inflation. Most of the bids used to be for £89,000 anyhow, so they just need to bid for a little bit more. But they're now in the same pool as, projects up to £250,000. And I suspect there's also a kind of feeling that what the Heritage Fund would like to do is to get rid of I mean, I may be completely wrong, but perhaps cynically, you think, well, is it helpful, rather than administering a whole loads of small grants, if they can administer a few bigger grants? And part of the new funding program is to get bigger organizations, and maybe this is a role for bigger organizations, to disperse funds, to be grant givers. So somebody like the university could apply, get the grant, and then they're sending out funding to small groups that they're working with on some project or another. So it remains to be seen. That's very new, that development, and we'll see what happens. That's all I thought I would say in terms of an introduction. So that's the end of me for now.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you. That's sorry, just perfectly timed as my boiler has kicked in to be nice and loud. But at least I've got rid of the cat that was sitting on top of my notes a few seconds ago. Thank you so much. That was a really good summary that really kind of introduced a lot of the challenges and the problems, as well as the successes and the achievements of the movement, and of actually, I think you've been quite modest, but your role in that over time. So my perspective on this comes from managing the Layers of London project, which Ruth alluded to earlier. Hopefully many of you will be familiar with the website layersoflondon.org. I'm sure someone could put that link in the chat if anyone wants an easy way into it. Which is in many senses a community archiving project in and of itself, but one which comes from an institutional university grounded basis. In a sense, I think the predecessors, mine who created that project, arrived at quite a similar set of aims to those that you arrived at, but coming from the opposite direction, or of coming from research-based, place-based histories to then thinking about community within those places and wanting to capture things from that sort of arriving from a different starting point, but getting to a similar point. So it's really interesting to sort of hear your reflections on that, and I think especially think about some of the areas where our experiences converge and some of the issues where we might be able to do more to help each other, and where both our experiences might help others developing projects in future. So you gave some quite diverse examples of sort of institutional involvement and partnership in community archiving. You mentioned intriguingly of there being a funded national centre for community archiving in Poland, which caught my interest, through to the collapse of the private proprietary software company Commonet, and the sort of earlier distrust between county archives and community archives and things. It sounded like you were painting a picture of things having moved towards a more positive accommodation. Is that fair? Are we now at a position of more fruitful collaboration?
Yes, I don't think there's. I don't think there's. Certainly, I think the tension between that there perhaps once was between kind of community groups and record offices has eased. And there are hugely helpful organisations. I mean, from the university point of view, is it the Roy? You might know the name of this. This kind of cataloging software called Omica, which is open source cataloging software, which is similarly priced to WordPress as a subscription model and easy to use, which is created by originally created by an academic institution in America and has been supported. I mean, it's a hugely helpful support. I think the thing that I think is interesting is I mean there's space for both, but when I always get a little bit wary of when I look back at the kind of the failures of community archives, the times when kind of material has really kind of suddenly vanished without trace, and I've had panicky phone calls from community archivists. It's often when there's been a national initiative. It's the big initiatives, so I think there was one in Northern Ireland, which they suddenly had loads of funding. They set up a big project, got lots of community archives, and then the funding ran out and they were gone. Conversely, on the other hand, you've got the kind of People's what's it called, People's Museum in Wales, or People's Record of Wales, which is still running as part of its core work. So I think there's a fantastic positive contribution to be made by organisations that make it part of their core ongoing purpose to support community heritage projects. A less positive contribution from ones that just want to get a little bit of funding by kind of using the community word, and then the project ends after 3 to 4 years.
Sustainability is
it's
always
all about sustainability, exactly, and absolutely this thing about export. I always think whatever project you provide, you must give groups their own export button. They should have a button they can press to get their content out again.
Yeah, that's a very important point. One thing, and yeah, that does raise sort of broader questions, I think, about sort of ethics and responsibility in these kind of partnerships, doesn't it? Partly, as you said, that's down to sort of fixed cycles of funding, and when something's no longer funded, it's difficult for people within an institution to justify expenditure on it. But also, I think the sort of question of initiative, and how far something can be organic versus how far something can be worked through strategic plans and funding application cycles that take a year or more to achieve. Is that still, does that create an insurmountable gulf at all, do you think? Certainly from our experience with the Layers of London, there was a lot of emphasis on, as the Heritage Fund grant holder, the University of London through that project, working with and supporting many different community groups to do that. But I think my colleagues and predecessors who were working on the project at that time found that quite labor intensive, or quite hard work, because things which had been put into the bid 2 or 3 years previously were no longer the same priorities that the groups had at the time.
Right.
And those kind of things. Is that something that resonates?
I mean, I can easily imagine that would be the case. Yes.
You mentioned the changes to the Heritage Fund structures to favouring larger grants, and you sort of suggested that universities could lead in those larger bids to support community archives through various projects. What would you say would be the priorities that a university wanting to go into something like that should keep in mind? How would the university best be a benevolent partner in that?
Well, one answer to that, I always remember I was at a conference years ago, and I think there was one museum, I think it was a London museum, had just been given a huge grant by the Arts Council or somebody like that. And it was the closing event of this big grant. And they'd gathered together all the kind of groups who had been involved, and they'd all received training, and they had all participated. And then one of the rather troublesome questions from the floor was, why is it that in these projects we always receive the training and you always receive the money? And so I think there's a kind of I think one of the things that one of the opportunities that the Heritage Fund is providing now is a way of actually recognizing that actually it's not. You sometimes get a big organization that's got the funding, it's got that's great for it. It needs to deliver its project to get community groups involved, but that takes their time, and their time is actually their currency. That's what they're so short supply of. And actually, if you can get to a point where you can actually recompense them for their time, and feed into their other ambitions, that would be a very good partnership, I think. So I think there's an opportunity there to be a grant giver and work in that way. Yeah.
So paying a very rounded approach to co-production, including money flowing as well as training. That's a very, very good point.
Yeah, just recompensing from them for their, accepting it takes time.
Good points. Some of the other issues that you raised focused around technology, and obviously there's been this sort of quite natural evolution over time and changing technologies. You closed with cloud storage as a positive, and some technologies like Drupal, which might give some of my colleagues sort of shivers
Yeah. She just
at dealing
fallen
with
by
its
the
various
wayside a bit,
challenges.
hasn't it? Yes.
Uh, do you see sort of solutions to these issues of sustainability emerging through?
No, I suppose I just hope that perhaps things have settled a little bit. I mean, it does seem to me that we're at least in a better position with cloud storage, where everything is being mirrored and everything is in one great big, bucket in the sky, than we were thinking, oh, we can put everything on CDs and we can spread jam on the CDs. I don't know whether you remember people saying that, and throw them across the room and it'll still be fine. And it wasn't. So the less dependence we have on some sort of kind of physical thing that can get scratched or broken, and the more things are automatically backed up, the better. So I suppose what I'm hoping, and I wonder whether kind of WordPress has been around longer than others. It's been around, say, longer than Dreamweaver. So I suppose I wonder whether the pace is slowing, the pace of change is slowing a bit. But I wouldn't like to bank on that. I mean, that'll be famous last words, wouldn't it?
I noticed on your Brighton site you had a message that you're being archived by the British Library Web Archive. Is that something that you've been sort of disseminating the word of asking people to make sure they're opted in to these kind of things, and are people picking up on that within the community archive community?
Yes and no. I mean, it's always nice, and it was kind of, I think groups like the idea of web archiving, and I think certainly, back in the day, UK Web Archive was more open. I think they're kind of potentially kind of overwhelmed now. But the kind of point I tend to make to groups is that the website is not it's not the repository. The repository is the material you need to archive is the underlying content. And I think a website is, personally, I think it's more like a long-term online exhibition. Museums look after what's in their storerooms. They have a back office that has a catalogue. And they make sure that catalogue follows standards and is migratable to other things and archivable. That exhibition space, that they change that every 10 years or whatever, and reinterpret things in different ways. And a website, by and large, is an exhibition space, which is very bound up in the technology of the moment. So what really matters is the underlying content. Can I get out of my website? Can I export from it the text of a page and the various media files, the file names of the media files associated with it, in a way that it could be recreated in some form or another? And I think it's kind of a lost cause to try and preserve the website as such.
Very, very good point. And just as pertinent with the university's own academic projects.
Right.
Still, I think far too many people putting together a research project see a website as an output, whereas, there's maybe an exhibition about the output, but it itself is not necessarily the output. That's a really good point, definitely.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you've raised quite a few perhaps related issues about social media and Facebook. And I guess are we already starting to see the turning tide of Facebook ceasing to have the influence that it might have done a few years ago? Certainly, I stopped using it, but
right, I don't know. I don't know about that. And I think probably a lot of. I think Facebook has certainly moved to the older generation. I gather it's no longer a thing that kind of young people want to be too much involved with. Which perhaps is not good news for it. But I don't think that, I think probably social media is here to stay. The days where, people want to use interfaces that they're already familiar with. And that's there's no getting away from that. When we were creating, the My Brighton CD, all those years back in that BBC Doomsday book, you would create a new interface for every single multimedia project, and the whole point was, oh, we're going to design a new interface. Nowadays, it's pointless doing that, because what people want is an interface they're already familiar with. They want the search box in the top right corner. They want the title in the top left. They don't want you to kind of, do anything new and innovative, because it's not helpful. So I think social media is here to stay, and I don't know how community heritage. I mean, if I was doing a project now, I would actually I would do an exploratory project to try and devise the best possible relationship between Brighton Past and My Brighton and Hove. Try and see how you could best get that to work. I don't think it could happen automatically. I think it would be a matter of kind of cherry picking the content and doing content agreements and stuff like that. But it'd be fascinating to see if you could really channel the power of social media in that way and get it into an archival form.
Yes. I mean, in a lot of senses, something like Facebook or Twitter now, they've closed their APIs to outside researchers. Are starting to resemble the Common.net sort of scenario described at the beginning, aren't they? Of being that sort of closed garden with no way of exporting things.
Well, very few proprietary systems, they have a lot of interest in importing stuff, but not in exporting stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I think you can export your own content from Twitter still, but
sure.
I'm not sure if Facebook. And for your comments on the ability to reverse search images for copyright makes me wonder if that might be a bit of an explanation as to why those social media platforms have closed down their API access in the past few years, actually, because certainly an awful lot of local history content on these groups is repeated endlessly, isn't it? And people resharing images, which maybe they don't have.
It's kind of the wild west of community heritage, isn't it?
Yes. Cool. Well, I think that there's a positive conclusion in here, though, isn't there? That it's the content that matters.
Absolutely.
And we can be creative and we can react and adapt things to suit people's familiar ways of accessing it. But it's the content that's king, and the content we need to archive.
It's the content and the human. I mean, the thing I've learned from 25 years of kind of watching these community heritage projects and community heritage websites, start up, some succeed, some don't succeed, is what the success factor is not the technology, and it's not the graphics. Actually, lots of people want their websites to look pretty, but it really doesn't matter if they don't. It really doesn't matter if the technology isn't kind of the latest thing. What really matters is the energy and the kind of warmth and interest of the people running it, the editorial team. It's the editorial effort. And if you're trying to set up something like My Brighton and Hove and get contributions, the answer is not to have a very easy to enter form, but when somebody sends in a comment, to get back to them within 24 hours and say, that sounds really fascinating. I'm a human being and I'm interested in what you've just said as a human being. Can you, send us some more content? And that's what makes things grow. And it's the editorial that is the key. And that's why I think the volunteer community archivists that are gold dust. And interestingly, I think in lots of the Heritage Fund applications I see, the editorial is always underfunded, whereas the technical is overfunded. Lots of money goes into technical stuff, and there isn't an editorial. Well, somebody will fit in the editorial post into their existing job. That doesn't work.
That certainly sounds like an important lesson. I think now is a point where we should perhaps see if anyone else has questions. So thank you so much, Jack, for that, enduring my probing questioning. But yeah, I will leave Ruth to see if she has any other questions or to chair questions from the audience.
Thank you both, Jack and Justin. That was wonderful. So yes, as I said at the beginning, if you have any questions, do write them in the chat or use the raise hand function to show that you'd like to ask a question. Catherine, would you like to start us off?
Thank you. I thought I'd jump in there. There's so many questions that I'd love to ask Jack, but I will limit myself. A really inspiring and just practically very useful presentation as well. Lots and lots of kind of tips to take away from that. I wanted to ask a question around challenges. So I was really interested in the slide you showed, and I think from some of our projects based in the centre, we recognise some of the challenges that the wider community archives participants are identifying there. You highlighted that challenge of recruiting new volunteers, perhaps bringing in the next generation. I wondered if you engage in much discussion, if your participants, communities share tips around engaging and reaching out to less well represented groups in community archiving. I think in many of the projects that we're involved with, we work with brilliant volunteers, but there's often a particular kind of profile, and we really aspire to involving a more diverse range of people in projects. So are there particular strategies for that? Are there things that are effective? I don't know if that's something that you're engaging with as well.
I mean, I suppose I've engaged with it at various times. I mean, I think it's always seems to me that, you know, the general principle is if you're trying to reach out to groups that are a bit harder to reach, then you do have to recognize that that's going to take, you have to structure your project accordingly, you know. So actually, if it's if 20% of the people you're trying to reach are the hard to reach, that's going to take 80% of your, 80% of your effort. And so I kind of I think there's work there, and I think that I suppose there is a great focus on trying to be more have a wider range of voices, and as you know, if you look at the kind of definition of community archives on Wikipedia, it's a lot about that. It's a lot about the non-standard, authorized voices telling their stories. So I think that's at the heart of it. But you know, it's practically difficult, and sometimes it feels a bit uncomfortable. You know, again, I'd like the money to go directly to them, and for them to be running their own projects. You know, I remember I did a project where it was Letter in the Attic. You know, we were collecting letters from around Brighton and Hove, and so you wanted to kind of get as a wider range of, letters and diaries as possible. And then you suddenly found yourself kind of approaching various communities, and the only reason you were doing it really was for your project. And I think that's a slightly uncomfortable relationship. I would rather they got the money, basically.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Jack. Really honest, and I like the challenge that you're presenting to us in that as well. Yeah. Thank you so much.
So just before I come to Sarah, Justin's just added in the chat a kind of follow-up. So the Brighton Museum tour you mentioned being most popular was the homeless person's perspective, but are they still underrepresented in a community archive?
Yes. Yeah. They absolutely are. And interestingly, in my Brighton and Hove, we didn't get a homeless person's perspective. You know, it wasn't for want of trying, but we didn't try hard enough. You know, I think various people were involved, and then we lost track of them, basically. So eventually, I did work with a guy who was homeless in a later project, and he did his own kind of tour of Brighton and Hove. But it was, it's not easy. It's not easy.
Thank you. Sarah, over to you.
Hi, that was really interesting, Jack. Thank you. And what you're doing is brilliant. I've moved around the UK a lot to new towns and villages and cities to work on heritage projects, and I've often found community archives really helpful, kind of professionally, but also personally, to link to a place. And right. I suppose because of my own experience, I wonder, do you think a community archive has to have a geographical centre in similarity to work as a community archive? Do you think that's key to how they function?
No, because there are kind of, there are ones that are built around performance venues, old music concert places, performance venues, on the south coast. There's quite a few I know that are done there. Workplaces as well. There's I think Waitrose and we've done projects with Waitrose and John Lewis about workplace communities. I think that the preponderance are geographical, but by no means all. And
So they still have to have that
sports
kind of-
clubs potentially.
Yeah. But you think they still need to have that kind of physical centre rather than a kind of a social characteristic or something that binds them together as a community?
Oh, that's interesting. No, I don't see why, really. I think in practice that's been the case, but I don't see why it shouldn't be a dispersed community.
I definitely think there's an interesting tension here, isn't there, between a kind of a digital archive that could be about anything and kind of hosted anywhere, and yet there is this kind of draw to developing these digital archives that are about physical places, and it allows an exploration of people's kind of memories, even if they're in dispersed places, to talk about kind of a physical place. I think it is really interesting, isn't it? And I've noticed when looking at like Facebook, local history Facebook groups, that often the people who are engaged in there aren't living there anymore. So they're people who have been there and are thinking back about that place and their memories of it, and they're reminiscing about it, rather than people who are there and are interested in that history in that moment. Although there are some people there, but most of the people who are commenting on it are people who are remembering a place that they've then left, which I think is very interesting.
And in a way, there's three legs to the stool, aren't there? There's the kind of, as you say, there's a diaspora, the people who have left, feeding their memories back in and are correspondingly interested. There are the people who live there, long-time locals, who are then the experts. And quite often there's a bit of dynamism that's provided by an incomer who is interested and curious and wants to make things happen and find out. So it's that combination of curiosity and sharing, which I think works
Yeah,
well.
which is a sensitive one, isn't it? Yesterday I did some field work in Wiltshire, and we went into a church, and there was a man came in, and we said, "Oh, are you the church warden?" And he was like, "No." I was like, "Oh, do you live here?" He's like, "I used to, and I'm very interested in the history of the area, but I was sort of pushed out by incomers, and they kept telling me that the history that I knew about this place was wrong, and that in the archives I'd found this, but that didn't align with my memories of this place." And we had this very interesting conversation around memories and documents, and what the two different stories that they tell, and how you might record those.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Okay, there are a few questions in the chat. So one says, "Thank you for being amazing. I wanted to ask, what's the simpler classification system that small community archive groups use currently, and was mentioned in contrast to kind of museum systems?"
Oh, right. Okay. It's something called the Community Archive Cataloguing Guidelines. And if you go to the Community Archives website and go to the resources section, you can find a link to it. I think it's under the featured, it's one of the featured resources there. And basically that was created, I mean, I got involved in creating it mainly because I started doing a cataloguing project. I was cataloguing letters and diaries, and I thought, the record officers use a system where lots of the terms are in Old French, and they have a kind of hierarchy of 7 layers of different sort of levels of overview records, designed to kind of do vast great collections. And so, community archives benefit from something simpler. So the idea was to simply, I sat down with somebody from a record office expert and somebody who's an expert in the system the museums use, which ultimately is Dublin Core, and tried to work out a set of core fields which could have user-friendly names, which would basically apply, mean that what you were doing would be consistent with either way of doing things. So there is I could talk about cataloguing for a long time. It's really a geeky way. There's a slightly different way in which the kind of record offices structure their catalogues and museums. And the interesting thing is that often will betray no knowledge of each other's systems. So if you go to a record office for advice, you'll be told about the record office way of cataloguing. If you go to a museum for advice, you'll be told about the museum way of cataloguing. You won't be told there's any other way of doing it. And actually, for community heritage groups, according to the circumstances, there are quite good practical reasons why you might want to do it the museum way or the record office way. And so, again, the community archive cataloguing guidelines try to bridge both.
Thank you very much. I'm going to quickly ask William's question and then I will come to Adam. So William said, thank you for your very good talk. You mentioned Omica. Are there many community groups using it in the UK? My sense has been that the UK libraries and archives have been poor promoters of it.
I imagine the UK archives and libraries they'll be using professional systems, I guess. And I guess Omica, I mean, some institutions use it, but I think it's largely for kind of for smaller things. But yeah, I mean, I think quite a lot of projects have used it. I mean, we used to use. I mean, for community sites, we used to use it. And then as WordPress evolved, we discovered we could make WordPress do all the things Omica does. So we don't use it anymore. But as a low budget way into just doing cataloging, then it's very good, and it's exportable, and it's standards compliant, and it's relatively easy. What you can do cheaply, if you're a kind of community heritage project wanting to get online, you can have your catalogue online at one web address cheaply and easily. You can have your main website, with the information about you and your exhibition space online at another web address cheaply and simply. Trying to get them both under the same roof, that's where you need kind of more professional help, because it's hard to integrate the two systems. And Omica won't do, the WordPress freeform stuff, and WordPress, it's a lot of work to make it do cataloging.
Thank you. Adam.
Remembering to unmute. Yeah, thanks, Jack. That was really, really interesting, and chimed to a lot of day job experience. It's sort of trying to wrangle a academic local history project with people's interest in local history, and always, and telling authors, you must write for the people who actually live in this place, so help them how their memories integrate with what you can find in the archive. That's not the point I was actually going to ask about. One of the things I think is very apparent in any local history or any interest group history is a sense of ownership of material and ownership and origins of where that comes from. And I was wondering if you had any observations about people being a bit gatekeepery about how they know stuff, and whether you think community archives are a way of getting around that or a way of reinforcing it.
Gatekeeper,
so I know this stuff and I'm not going to tell you how I know it, but it's important that you trust me on this.
I don't know, I've come across that so much with people claiming, particular, I am the only person who knows why this particular church is the way it was, or whatever it is. I do think there is which is a very human thing, that if you have somebody who's invested many years of their life in being the expert and having the knowledge and having the folders, and they've collected the photos and the postcards, etc., they are sometimes reticent about sharing that with some new community archive project that's kind of leapt up 2 years ago, understandably, and it takes a fair amount of trust winning to and they might also be running their own website, etc., etc.
Very commonly, yeah.
But I mean, but a lot of it's the other way around as well. A lot of community heritage projects spring up because they say, "Help! The old doctor in the village has been collecting old photos and postcards. He's the expert, but he's now in his 80s, and soon his folders and folders of old photos in his room are going to just be that without him. What are we going to do?"
Which takes us back to the editorial point you were making earlier. Some different aspects, it's how do we actually piece these things together?
Yeah.
and it is curiously undervalued in the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I find local history groups is with Victoria County history content is often recycled without any of the badging
Right.
left on. Sometimes with the maps and images, and it's very easy to spot where it comes from because we have a
Right.
well. I don't mind you doing that, but if you're going to do it and say this is your research, I am going to call you out on it because
Yeah. You want credit to be
as
given.
happened with the volume I edited. Like, lads,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
So it's a tension there. It's a tension.
Yes. They're quite.
Thank you. So Lucy has written in the chat, thank you for the wonderful talk, Jack. You're doing valuable work. I'm an organizer of a community archive, which received one of those short-term output-orientated digital archiving grants that you alluded to. 2 years on, funding has long since dried up. Our WordPress plugins are no longer functional, and we have no recourse to more funding or free low-cost technical proficiency. Any advice for community archives who find themselves in this predicament? Are we now just lumbered with a broken website? We're really a case in point in terms of sustainability and longevity or lack thereof.
It's tricky, isn't it? It's difficult to know without knowing the details, really. Blah blah blah. Any advice? It's difficult. I mean, yeah, because the solution is I feel, in my work I get rung up by groups in that kind of predicament, so they've but it's difficult if they haven't you can't keep something online of any complexity without either money or some kind of technical proficiency. So if you're not willing to if you're not able or willing to kind of think about how are we going to sustain this in future, either technically ourselves, that we'll have the volunteers who can do it, or getting the finance to do it, then you need to keep things very, very, very simple. WordPress sites, a basic WordPress site can update itself so long as you don't make it at all complicated. Omica will kind of keep itself going by and large, as long as you don't try and do anything too difficult. But it's when you have a gap between what you immediately aspire to do in your first 2 years and what you can support afterwards that you run into problems.
So with that in mind, Jack, what would be your sort of recommendations if someone's starting something to ensure that in kind of the long term it would be relatively sustainable? Kind of what does simplicity look like in that?
It's a branch in the road. I mean, basically if somebody comes to community sites where we provide kind of websites and cataloging software, they can keep it going, but then they need to probably find hosting and maintenance. And we keep that as small as we possibly can because we know the problem. But nonetheless, they've got to find a few £100 a year. So you either have a branch in the road where your committee says, right, we are going to be committed to, we think we can raise several £100 a year, whether that's selling calendars or doing crowds for funding or whatever. Or no, we don't want to do that. We never want to make a funding application. We don't want to get involved in the world of raising funds, in which case you have to go down what's free. And that tends to be kind of WordPress and Omica and things like that. But they're both perfectly viable approaches. But yeah, you get more complexity and more integration if you are prepared to, if you can find a way to fund it on an ongoing basis to some degree.
Thank you. If there are any more questions, do put them in the... So Lucy's just said, thank you for such a considered answer. Maybe simplification is the one workaround. Yeah, Lucy, it does sound like simple can be better in this set of circumstances. So there's a question here. Can I ask for an elaboration on best principles for starting digital community archives?
I would probably go and have a look at the Community Archives website, because we've got a resources section, and that will kind of go through it. Just one thing I'd say, just because a lot of people don't realise it, is that your website, your online catalogue is not your repository. You know, when you scan images, the principle is that you scan them at a high resolution. So you create a high quality file, which is accordingly a big file. And that's not what you upload to your website or your catalogue. You tend to upload a smaller version of that, which is more easily downloadable and exportable, and a reference copy, basically. And so your repository is that original set of files, the source files that you've scanned, which you then store on the cloud or an external hard drive or something like that. So one principle is to pay attention to how you originally kind of capture the material, and then look after that. The consent forms is another thing it's worth doing. That's the other thing people forget doing when they start out.
Thank you. I had a question. You had some really nice points in your presentation about process sometimes being more important or more valuable than what actually comes out at the end. And I just wondered, in your experiences, what are people gaining from engaging in that process? What are the things that they get from it?
Well, in Ireland, there's the Museum of Ireland. Runs a project called the Irish Community Archive Network, and I mean, I know about that because they use our software. But it's run by a kind of wonderful woman now called Lorna Elms, and she has done a whole project into researching what groups get out of the process, and there's a lot of learning. There's a lot of thereby growing in confidence, because you are running your own project, you're learning new skills, you're collaborating with other people. So it's quite a empowering process, I think, for some people. And you're validating your knowledge, you're honoring what you know. You suddenly discover you are a historical artifact in your own right.